So friends, our gospel this morning is from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. Of course, it is this story that I told the children of this storm at sea. What I wasn't able to do in my sermon was to kind of comment on this epistle that Hetty just read without going, as you summer preachers know, without going into the fifth page too far. I told them, look, when I get to the fifth page, they start leaving me behind. So anyway, I just wanted to say what I would have done in a nutshell was, like, in that passage, Paul is saying today is the day of salvation. He's talking about rejoicing in the moment, but then all of this calamity, all of this resistance, all of these storms that he and his churches are experiencing. So what the message is that you don't have to wait until after you die to experience the peace, love, and presence of God, that even in the moment, even in the calamity, even in the storms, we can find that peace. So, friends, listen to the gospel of Christ. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let's go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And waking up, Jesus rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be silent, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So a few years ago, I was driving home from church to Webster Groves on Big Bend. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and so the streets were, it's not rush hour really, but the streets were pretty full. And as I approached that busy intersection at Manchester Road, I could see in my side view mirror that a car had gotten into the two-way center lane and was using it to pass all this traffic to get up to the red light. That's what it appeared to be, and you know me, it irritated me. Like, why is this person cutting in line and it's not safe, right? But then as the car passed me, it slowly drifted into oncoming traffic, and then it was up on the sidewalk, and then it was crashing through this metal fence, and finally it hit a concrete wall and came to a stop. But the car was still running, and the driver's foot must have been on the accelerator because the back tires were spinning full speed, creating this huge cloud of burnt rubber. And by then, I had stopped at the light kind of right across from this car, and the driver appeared to be unconscious. The car seemed to be filling with smoke, and several people were trying to open the car doors to get him out, but they were locked. So I quickly pulled out my phone and dialed 911, and nothing happened. And I tried again, 911, nothing happened. Again, 911, nothing happened. I was in such a panic that I was dialing 911 into my lock screen. It doesn't work. I tried it the other day to see, does it work? Now, it doesn't work. So in truth, I hate to admit it, I'm not always the most clear thinking, at least at the beginning of a storm. So don't depend on me. Depend on yourselves. So while all this is going on, the driver is still unconscious. The car is roaring. Several adults are trying to open the door. I'm still dialing 911 into my lock screen. While all this is going on, a young skateboarder dude, I would call him, calmly walks across Manchester from the Quick Trip. He's maybe 15 or 16 years old. And I thought, what is this kid going to do? Take some pictures? And he just walks up to the passenger door, raises his skateboard like a baseball bat, smashes the passenger door, reaches in, unlocks the door, opens the door, reaches in, turns the car off, reaches over the driver, unlocks the door so these other people can pull him out. Wow. I wish I was like that in a storm. So by then, the police and the fire departments were arriving, and the light had turned green, and I don't really know what happened. I pulled away, sort of wondering, what's wrong with my phone? But that image of the young man is just in my head, crossing that street, doing exactly what needed to be done to save the driver. And I suppose from everyone's point of view on the scene, at least mine, or including mine, he was the least likely character in this whole drama to play the role of Jesus. But there he was, playing the role of Jesus and calmly saving the day. So in today's little gospel story, Jesus demonstrates that it is possible to remain calm even in the fiercest storms of life. It's possible to remain calm. It's possible to be a calming presence for others. And it's possible to offer your peaceful presence to the world, to creation around you. So on the one hand, this is a story about a storm at sea. So Jesus and his disciples, they were fishermen. They were often in boats. And if you are in boats regularly, this is just a part of it. Storms arise. Threatening storms arise. And even if you are a skilled captain, it can be threatening and scary, and panic can ensue. So I remember reading this story in Sailing Magazine a few years ago. The author had a boat. I think he was in San Francisco Bay. He had a boat, and it was an experienced sailor, and he was taking some friends out. Gorgeous day, he said at the beginning, like 80 degrees, but the people he was taking had never been on a sailboat before. So he says, as he was rigging the boat, he noticed that there was a problem with the foresail, and it was the halyard is what lifts the foresail. I think what he said is that the halyard had some knot in it, so it wasn't quite right, but it was a calm day, and they were running late, and so he's like, oh, it's going to be fine. So they head out, and of course the weather changes, and the temperature drops, and they are in this storm, and the rain is freezing them, and he pulls down the mainsail, and then he tries to pull down that foresail, but that knot won't let it come down. And now he's afraid that this actually might knock the boat over. It's just so much wind. And so what he ended up having to do was give the helm to an inexperienced person. And I don't know if you've ever been on a sailboat, like you might think you need to be turning this way, but you really need to be turning this way. Or you might need to really just let out some sail. Anyway, he had to crawl on his hands and knees to the front of the boat with a knife to cut that sail free. And even then, when you do that, it's raging in the wind. And so they limp back to harbor, and they are soaked to the bone, cold, terrified, and exhausted. It was a little lesson about making sure your boat is really ready to go. So even with the most experienced sailors, when you are in boats, threatening storms can arise. So this is a story about a storm at sea, but it's also about Jesus' ability to remain calm in the storms of life. So when you look at the gospel stories, remember, Jesus meets people with horrible, horrible diseases. He encounters children who are sick. He encounters children who have died. And he encounters the deep grief of those children's parents. He cares for people possessed by demons who shout at him. And he was regularly confronted by angry religious people who had no problem, just as he's leading the synagogue meeting, shouting out and criticizing him. Imagine trying to do that. So in fact, when in this story, when Jesus and his disciples get through this storm and they arrive on the other side, they meet a man who is so in the grip of demons that his fellow citizens have cast him out into like a cemetery area outside of the town, and they tie him up with iron chains, but the demons make him so strong that he can break those chains. So Jesus gets to shore from this storm and walks into that storm. But in all of this, Jesus remains calm. Jesus never says, this is too much. Why is this happening to me? He remains calm, and he offers his healing peace to those around him. So in this instance, he is even able to offer peace to the wind and the sea. And that may seem miraculous, and it is miraculous. And part of what the gospel writers are saying here is that in the same way God at creation sort of tamed the chaotic waters, Jesus has that same kind of energy and power of God. So it may seem miraculous, but it's not really impossible. So if you really understand the interconnectedness of all of creation, why wouldn't Jesus be able to calm the world around him? Why wouldn't his calm be infectious to other people and other things? So I think you probably know this, but there are Tibetan monks who can meditate for hours in below freezing temperature with just a little linen cloth over them and not get hypothermia. Their meditative practice can create heat, and they can modify their body temperature even in those extremes. So that's not exactly the same thing, but if you've learned to take control over your body like that, you don't really need to control the wind, right? You just are being calm yourself in any circumstance. So Jesus is himself calm even as the boat is being swamped. So calm, in fact, that he remains asleep in this storm until his disciples wake him. And once awake, his peace infects the wind and the sea, and they too become calm. But even after the storm, the disciples remain shaken. They are afraid. So our translation says this: they were filled with great fear. But a literal translation of the Greek is something more like this: being filled with fear, great fear, they said. So what's going on here is Mark is using both the verb and the noun for fear. So he's kind of doubling down on the fear. He's saying that they were really, really afraid, and this is after Jesus calmed the storm. So Jesus was able to calm himself. He was able to calm the wind. He was able to quiet the sea. But for some reason, he was unable to calm his own disciples even after the storm had passed. Why is that? So I would guess it is because they had human minds like we do. And our minds tend to keep fear alive. So in both of his most popular books, Eckhart Tolle has a section that he calls the duck with the human mind. The duck with the human mind. And there he shares his observation that after two ducks get in a fight, they vigorously flap their wings and then peacefully float off in different directions as if nothing had ever happened. And then he asked this question: imagine what it would be like if a duck had a human mind. If the duck had a human mind, it would keep the fight alive by thinking, by telling itself stories. And then he says, this would probably be the duck's story. I don't believe what that other duck just did. He came to within 5 inches of me. He thinks he owns this pond. He has no consideration for my private space. I'll never trust him again. The next time he tries something like that, just to annoy me, I am going to show him. I'm sure he's plotting something right now. I'm not going to stand for this. I will teach him a lesson he will never forget. And on the mind spins its tail, still thinking and talking about it days, months, maybe even years later. And then Eckhart Tolle concludes with this: think how problematic the duck's life would be if it had to live like this. And then he adds, but this is how most humans live all the time. So when Jesus woke up and rebuked the wind and the sea, as I said earlier, he said, "Be silent, be still." And these words apply as much to the human mind as they do to any storm at sea. And as I mentioned at the children's time, it occurs to me that these words of Jesus would make a nice breathing prayer. Imagine that in Jesus' own words. You breathe in, and Jesus' own words are coming through you, "Be silent." You breathe out, Jesus' voice is there saying, "Be still, be silent, be still." So the storm had passed, and the disciples were still afraid, very afraid. Why? Because in part they had human minds, but also because they had no faith. And that's not my criticism. Those are Jesus' words. He says to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" So in Mark's gospel, the opposite of faith is not unbelief. It's not doubt. It is fear. In Mark especially, you either are filled with fear or you are filled with faith. So faith is really something more like trust. You're filled with fear that it's going to be a calamity, or you really trust that everything is going to be okay. That's faith. It's trust. So Jesus asks them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith, no trust?" And I suppose the same question could be asked of us. So we are all still here. After the many, many storms we've all been through, maybe after 9 years, 12 years, 20 years, 50 years, 90 years, we're all still here. And yet, even after all those years, it's hard to trust that it really will be okay when these storms arise. So the question of faith is really something like this. Do you really trust that everything is going to be okay? So it's more about a deep experience in the soul than it is about a conviction of the mind. So faith is not, I believe God exists. Faith is not, I believe Jesus was God or Jesus died for my sins. Faith is knowing deep in your soul that no matter what happens, it's going to be okay. Knowing that there is really nothing to fear in this life. That is faith. So St. Paul put it this way. He said to the church, "If we live, we live to the Lord. If we die, we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's." So what that means is even if that boat had sunk that night in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, the disciples were and always are still the Lord's. Paul also said this, "Nothing in life or in death is able to separate us from the love of God." Nothing on either side of the lake or out in the middle can take away God's love. So in short, you are the Lord's and you are loved. And no storm in this life can ever change that. Thanks be to God. Amen.